Turkey's human rights record has crossed from troubling to indefensible. Behind the language of counterterrorism and national security lies a systematic campaign that has dismantled the rule of law, criminalized dissent, and stripped hundreds of thousands of their most basic rights. In the aftermath of 2016 attempted coup, Turkish President Erdogan embarked on a sweeping consolidation of power that has since metastasized into one of the most far-reaching assaults on human rights in modern era. What began under the pretext of emergency rule has evolved into a permanent architecture of repression targeting judges, journalists, political opponents, minorities, and civil society. The cumulative effect is the hollowing out of democratic institutions and the transformation of citizenship itself into a conditional status contingent on loyalty to the regime. Alongside this authoritarian consolidation, Erdogan has deliberately fused Islamic identity with state politics, steadily eroding the secular foundations of the republic. By casting himself as a defender and a de facto leader of the Sunni Muslim world, he frames his domestic and foreign policies in quasi-religious terms, implying a higher moral sanction. This conflation of faith and governance discourages dissent and imbues political authority with a divine aura of legitimacy. Arbitrary detention and mass purges. UN data indicate that around 160,000 people were arrested and 152,000 public employees were dismissed during the first 18 months of the emergency rule, after the 2016 military coup, often without individualized evidence or due process. Teachers, judges, prosecutors, police, and military officers were summarily purged, losing income, housing, and social benefits overnight. Erdogan's emergency decrees allowed for the arrest of those with links to or connections to terrorist organizations without defining what was meant by links, enabling a system of nebulous collective punishment. He institutionalized authoritarianism, making freedom contingent on political loyalty rather than on universal rights. Torture, ill treatment, and suspicious deaths. UN report documents detail of extensive human rights violations, beating, sexual assault, electric shocks, and waterboarding in police custody and pre-trial detentions amounting to systematic torture, routine ill treatment, enforced stressed positions, deprivation of sleep, and a threat against detainees' families with numerous suspicious deaths in custody. This classic negation of human dignity, justified in post-coup Turkey, where the state claimed the right to inflict pain beyond any legal or moral constraints, destroyed the very idea of the rule of law. Prioritized judiciary and destruction of the rule of law. International observers describe a collapse of judicial independence, with thousands of judges and prosecutors dismissed or prosecuted, then replaced by loyalists. The European Court of Human Rights has issued landmark judgments finding systematic violations, including human or degrading treatment and violation of the right to a fair trial. Turkish courts, rather than following the rule of law and respecting citizen rights, have become instruments of executive will. This weakens the idea that the state's power is justified by respecting people's fundamental rights. Criminalization of political opposition. Erdogan has criminalized the opposition, arresting and jailing dozens of opposition party CHP members, including Istanbul's mayor, on spurious charges, widely seen as a calculated move to block a formidable challenger in the upcoming elections. These lay bare the regime's readiness to weaponize the judiciary for political survival. By equating dissent with terrorism, Erdogan has emptied the public sphere of legitimate contestation, denying citizens any meaningful political voice. Repression of Kurds and militarized collective punishment. Since 2016, at least 4,920 members of the pro-Kurdish HDP, including MPs and mayors, have been falsely accused and imprisoned on terrorism-related charges. An OHCHR report describes killings, torture, destruction of housing and cultural heritage, and severe movement restrictions in the Kurdish majority southeast. Military operations have razed neighborhoods, displaced large populations, and suppressed lawful Kurdish political representations, including neutralizing HDP governance in municipalities. Collective punishment of Kurds exemplifies structural discrimination, rights, and applied differently by ethnicity and received political sympathy. When an entire group's claim to equal membership is denied, it contradicts any notion of justice as fairness in which basic liberties must be secured equally. Suppression of media freedom and expression. Erdogan has imprisoned scores of journalists and media workers, while shutting or taking over numerous outlets and blocking over 1 million websites. Vague offenses such as insulting the president and spreading terrorist propaganda are routinely used to prosecute reporters, academics, and social media users. Freedom of expression isn't just another right. It is fundamental to truth-seeking and holding power accountable. Erdogan's systematic expressions has a ripple effect. Abuses remain hidden, public debate is replaced by propaganda, and citizens lose the capacity for autonomous judgment, thereby undermining both liberal and constructive ideas of a legitimate democracy. Violations of women's LGBTQ+ rights. Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention in 2022 removed a key regional safeguard against gender-based violence amid rising femicide and impunity concerns. These measures have left women and girls especially exposed to violence with few protections, raising fear and diminishing access to justice. Authorities have simultaneously encouraged homophobic rhetoric targeting LGBTQ+ students and activists, and used police force against pride events and women's marches. These attacks on women's and LGBTQ+ rights clash with respect for basic rights, and they break the modern constitutional promise that the state protects people from private and public violence. Targeting human rights defenders and academics and civil society. Prominent human rights defenders have been jailed on fabricated charges despite binding international judgments demanding their release, such as noted activist Osman Kavala. Academics who sign peace petitions or criticize security policies have faced prosecution, dismissal, and travel bans, shrinking the space for independent scholarship and advocacy. Civil society, independent intellectuals, and conscience-driven actors are key to translating social suffering into public claims. Prosecuting them is a mutilation of a meaningful dialogue. It ensures that domination goes unchallenged and that everyday life can't push back against systematic control. Refugees abuses, forced return, and border violence. Turkey hosts approximately 3.2 million Syrian refugees and large numbers of Afghan and others. Yet, reports document pushbacks, forced return to unsafe areas in Syria, and violence by security forces and local proxies. Human rights organizations have criticized deportation and coercive voluntary return schemes as violating the principle of non-refoulement. Refugees occupy a transitional status present in the community, but not full members, leaving them especially vulnerable to being used as tools. In Turkey, they are restricted from freedom of movement and employment opportunities, living precarious lives. Abusing refugees reveal the gap between proclaimed universal human rights and their actual dependence on the mercy of the host country. Disappearances and extraterritorial abductions. Extraterritorial renditions have been orchestrated with the help of other countries. Between 2016 and 2019 alone, Turkey abducted and repatriated at least 100 suspected Gulenists from outside the country. These forced disappearances and clandestine rendition took place in countries like Pakistan and Azerbaijan. Victims are often seized without legal process, transferred to Turkey, held in secret, and tortured to exact confessions or cooperations. Such practices extend authoritarian power beyond territorial borders, undermining the very idea of universal human order in which individual rights carry across borders. Measures to stop Erdogan's gross human rights violations. NATO and the EU have avoided confronting Turkey's sweeping human rights violations, largely due to Ankara's strategic importance and energy considerations. To preserve their legitimacy, however, they must adopt concrete measures, diplomatic, economic, and legal, to curb Erdogan's egregious human rights violation and be held accountable. 1. Completely suspend Turkey's voting rights from the Council of Europe and potential expulsion for defying European courts of human rights rulings. 2. Officially terminate Turkey's EU membership negotiations until democratic standards and human rights protections are restored. 3. Exclude Turkey from a critical NATO decision-making process and intelligence sharing on matters requiring democratic accountability. 4. Refer Turkey's systematic violation to the International Criminal Court for investigations of crimes against humanity. 5. Impose targeted asset freezes and visa bans on Turkish officials responsible for torture, arbitrary detention, and prosecution. 6. Coordinate NATO and EU members to hold military technology transfer and defense cooperation with Turkey. And 7. Establish a county-specific monitoring mechanism with a quarterly reporting requirements and accountability measures. Turkey's trajectory is not merely a domestic tragedy. It is a direct assault on the integrity of international human rights system. When a state can so brazenly defy legal norms and binding judgments without consequences, it erodes the very foundation meant to safeguard human dignity everywhere. While it is unrealistic to expect meaningful action from the United States under Trump, the European Union, NATO, and the United Nations can and must act decisively or risk rendering their professed values hollow.